couple quick little notes about the video I'm about to share. In this video, all I'm doing is reading and adding a couple thoughts and musings to an entry from my journal from a couple months ago. I am in no way telling you uh, how to think or how to function or whether or not you should go to church and so forth. Secondly, there's 7 notes in my journal, but I only share 5 of them. So just keep that in mind. There's more reasons that I'm rethinking or deconstructing the word and concept and idea of church as we know it in the Western evangelical charismatic community.
Magandang umaga. I'm Hannah Joy, and this is Rejoice Refuge, a safe haven where we talk about all kinds of things. Occasional appearances and often background noise brought to you by my fur babies and co-hosts. By the way, I scripted this. I wrote this all out in my journal. It's just easier for me to read what I wrote and sometimes do stuff by the seat of my pants. Anyways, when rethinking the Western evangelical Christian concept and word church, as with many things one might rethink as it relates to the Christian faith, it can help to go back, all the way back in history. 1. First of all, it can be helpful to look at the development of the idea and creation of the church building, as we know it in Western culture. It began when the Catholics decided to be the only recognized state-governed sanctioned religion. After all, it's not easy to be sanctioned as a recognized religion, never mind the only right denomination, without a set of rules to cover all churches when there is no building. Nothing to truly define what that sect or religion looked like, sounded like, should function. And that was when church moved from being a simple communion of fellowship of believers meeting in houses to having a church building. By having a building, it helped facilitate rules and made it much easier to regulate those said rules. Not to mention, it was now easier to find such gatherings even when parishioners moved their residence. Side note, this was also when tithing became a thing, as buildings needed funds to maintain. Wasn't a thing before that. It's another discussion. 2. We cannot simply rethink the building or location of believers' meetings, rethinking the concept of church as we know it today in Western evangelical charismatic Christianity, without also looking back at the word and concept of pastor and how it became almost synonymous with preacher, not to mention head of the local gatherings. For in the New Testament, and for many decades after, there was not only meetings in houses, but everyone preached, for everyone took their turns in sharing. Kind of an interesting thought, right? The concept of a pastor was someone who has a pastoral type gift, no different in elevation or authority of gifts than any other gift or talent. This gift was of someone who cared for others, who visited the sick, and the like. The preacher, it is thought, was an idea that first came into being when orators, which are people that have a way with words, from carnivals, or in my opinion, like a modern day, we would call it salesman, like car salesman. Um, when those people who had a way with words became believers, it was finding them a spot and utilizing this talent. Sure, there were occasionally times when people, like the Apostle Paul, traveled to another location and everyone flocked to hear him, to learn from him, to sit in his presence, and to let him educate. FYI, little side note, apostle was the word that we now call missionary. In other words, the Apostle Paul was literally missionary Paul. And so, yeah, when a missionary comes, people flock to hear him. Didn't mean he was the preacher of, you know, forever of that congregation. Anyway, but outside of these special occasions, and they were more like teachers even then, there were no one preacher. For all preached, all shared, all took their turns, or had at least an opportunity to take a turn. 3. Therefore, church as it once was, I imagine would have been more similar to a Bible study or home group now. And when the verse says to not neglect our meeting together in Hebrews 10:25, it, in my opinion, was a little bit more like saying, hey, don't neglect hanging out with other believers, having those conversations over dinner, spontaneously pulling out that guitar and having a little worship session after dessert. Just an FYI, that is my guitar. Taking the time to truly fellowship, while also possibly prophesying and praying for each other, breaking bread in remembrance of Christ, and so on. For the meetings weren't scripted. They weren't liturgical, although they certainly tried to have some parameters to keep them from being too messy. I mean, you can find that in some of the letters that the apostles wrote. 4. So when I rethink church, I can't help but wonder, what have we done? The Bible says we are not to be like others by having a hierarchy system, and you can find that in Mark 10 and Matthew 20. Yet by establishing pastors and preachers as head over the institutional church, or if you're Catholics, bishops and priests, have we not done just that? Have we not done what Christ literally said in Mark 10 and Matthew 20 we're not supposed to do? There's a thought. I added a side note here that it kind of reminds me of uh, the story of Israel in the Old Testament. So in 1 Samuel 8, there's the story of the Israelites, and God was like, I don't want to give you a king. Let me be the ruler. And Israel's like, no, we want to be like all the other nations. We don't know how to rule without having a, like, we don't know how to govern and function without a head. And so God, like, begrudgingly gave them a king. Um, it just, I made a side note it feels like we're repeating history. And here in the New Testament, Jesus is saying the same thing, like, hey, I don't want you to be like everybody else. You are not going to have a leader. You are not going to have a hierarchy system. And then what did we do a few decades after Jesus left and ascended back to heaven? We create pastors, preachers. We create head over an institution, bishop, whatever you want to call it. course, one might argue that we cannot possibly run such a great multitude of people without some sort of board over the institution, which we call church in the Christian setting. The board, we might call them elders or deacons or lay pastors or whatever, but I cannot help but wonder if those words or concepts aren't also in need of deconstructing from their misuse. Or if you prefer the word rethinking instead of deconstructing, because I can't help but wonder, what are they actually supposed to be? Was it more like, hey, this is the host of this little small group, and we call them an elder? This is the person who's in charge of the finances and making sure that we go and support the right people. But they weren't the head. But I would further rethink with the additional thought and question of whether perhaps we were never actually supposed to grow so big that we would need a board. What if, when we got too big to fit in a house, we were simply supposed to find another believer willing to host meetings in their house, thereby creating two, then three, and so on? If, that is, we were ever supposed to have one house as the designated house. For perhaps we were to all take turns as we could. I don't know, there's like different speculation about what the early gathering of believers looked like. Uh, but it is an interesting thought to realize that we didn't have a head. We had hosts. We had certain people that were in charge of like the finances and things like that, but there wasn't like a one person in charge of everything. And I can't help but wonder if when we started establishing pastors, if we didn't do more than just create a hierarchy, we created an idolatry. It's a thought. Definitely a lot to think about since I've started rethinking or deconstructing the concept and word of church, right? So, 5. When rethinking church, the question that plagues my head is, are we, in all actuality, neglecting the true fellowship whenever we prioritize the institution and Sunday service meeting time? One of the things I like to study and learn, since it is something that does not come naturally to me as an autistic, is body language. So a few months ago, I was watching and listening to a video from a lady who, does a lot of things on body language, what different things can mean. She was talking about what makes someone well-liked or popular. And after studying people for a while, she came to the conclusion it was little micro moments or micro relationship expressions. It was while walking down a hallway, a person might high five Fred, then pause briefly with Nancy to ask how her dad is doing, then wave at Lucy, and so on. The more friends, if you will, the more popular. But I would argue that was simply actually what we call in the social media and internet world as a parasocial relationship. A parasocial relationship is not really real. They are simply perceived as real. We might even also feel like they're real, but how much depth can there be when spread so thin in such small increments? Like, how much depth can I really have with all those people when I have like a 3-minute intermission break between worship and Sunday morning service, um, in the preaching, to see everybody and say hi, and that's all I get is a couple minutes every now and then with Jack and half a minute over here with Nancy. But how much depth can there be when the relationship is spread so thin and in such small increments? The Bible says in Proverbs 18:24, a person of too many friends comes to ruin. And according to the commentaries, that is because when trouble hits, those friends are found to be not true friends. They're simply there for the parties and fun, for the fame by association. Did you catch that? You're popular because you say hi to 20,000 different people just in walking down an aisle at church on Sunday. And because you're popular, everybody wants to be around you, everybody wants to hang out with you, but nobody actually knows you. So when trouble hits, where are they? They were simply there for the parties and fun and fame by association. The second half of that verse, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother, though speaks of a friend who truly knows you. My phone is kicked on, so I'm going to give it a minute. I know, baby. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. This part speaks of a friend that truly knows you, like a sibling might. So, a couple example stories. One day, someone from church was talking about a mutual, and in describing them, they added, like you. I've seen you at church. You have so many friends. Driving on my way home later that day, I kind of cried about that, thinking about how wrong they were. For I did not feel like I had many friends at all. I had fans, or perhaps followers. It brought to mind another story. The time someone else had said how they were glad to see I must be doing or feeling better, as they had noticed me smiling, singing, and dancing more carefree lately during the Sunday morning service. But all I could think at that time was how little they knew me. To not know that sometimes I am most content and happy when I am still, that perhaps I had been the most happy and content when that friend had perceived I was the opposite. Kind of made me rethink, like, how well do these people that I call friends, are they really friends? How much do they actually know me? Ultimately, I came to the stark and sad realization that in my attempt to be a good Christian woman, by attending a Sunday morning service every Sunday, and I do mean every Sunday, like rain, snow, sleet, shine, unless I was on death's door, I attended service. There was even a time where I went to the ER for something and had like maybe 2 hours of sleep at best when I got home before I went to church. Like, I still went. I was very religious about attending church. So I came to the stark and sad realization that in my attempt to be a good Christian woman by attending a Sunday morning service every Sunday, I had neglected actual fellowship. I could not help but wonder not only who might truly know me, but who did I truly know? At least at that church. I realized I had more parasocial relationships at that church than I did on the Clock app or any other social media, because I realized I was putting my time and effort in attending church instead of not neglecting the fellowship, as people seem to quote that Proverbs 18:24. In other words, in my attempt to prioritize church, I did not have the time, nor energy, nor inclination to actually cultivate true, meaningful relationships. And I realized that for me at least, I needed to choose one or the other, as my body and health could not seem to do both. In other words, I stopped attending a Sunday morning service in lieu of attending a Wednesday evening Bible study, Thursday evening Celebrate Recovery, lunches or dinners with friends. When, in order to attend a Sunday morning service, I have almost no energy and have to take the next day or two off, if you will, it became apparent that that was exhausting. Not only are mornings hard, but the church was honestly, it was too big. And I had a lot of fans, not friends. And so I've opted to cultivate the relationships with a few of them from that church and some others from other churches, and just really work on trying to get to know people and be there for the ones that have been there for me and so forth. So I present to you these questions to ponder or comment and respond as you feel like. 1. What does church mean to you? 2. What should church mean to you? 3. What have you prioritized versus neglected that may need a redo or deconstructing or whatever word you prefer to use? Think on it. Remember, find your voice, y'all, because you are worth being heard, being seen, and being known. Magandang araw. Until next time, continue being a blessing.